These are some of the homework questions from 4.5 on the pre-calculus textbook. The amplitude is the absolute value of A, so this first one has an amplitude of 4. So that means it goes to 4 and down to -4. The period for both of these will be 2 pi over B. What's the B here and what's the B here? So 2 pi over 1 makes the period 2 pi. What's the amplitude in this second one here? So that means I go to 1/3 and -1/3. You'll notice again how it's easier to sketch the curve and then label the axes. If you label the axes and try and fit your curve to it, good luck. Some people do it better than others. It's not easy. Okay, what's half of 2 pi? 1 pi. So the middle one is 1 pi. Half of 1 pi is 1/2 pi. This is 0. So you have 0/2 pi, 1/2 pi, 2/2 pi. What should be here? 3/2 pi. And 4/2 pi, which is 2. Now that I know that, I should be able to label my maximums and minimums. What is this maximum? It would be x is pi over 2, the y is 4. 3 pi over 2, comma, -4. Let's do the second one here. If that's pi, halfway between 0 and pi is 1/2 pi. This would be 1 and 1/2 pi before you get to 2 pi. So what are these coordinates here for the maximum? Pi over 2, comma, 1/3. And what's this coordinate? 3 pi over 2, -1/3. Okay, we're going to move on to 5 and 7. This is a sine, so it starts at the origin. This is a sine, so it starts at the origin. The sine is positive. It looks like a normal sine wave. It goes up, down, and up. But this has a negative in front of it. So instead of starting upward, what's it going to do? It's going to start downward. So it's going to go down, then up. It basically kind of flips it over the x-axis. What is the amplitude on this first one here on number 5? What is the absolute value of -3? So 3 is the amplitude. What's the amplitude on number 7? 1. So you go 1 and -1. What is the period if it's 2 pi over b? What's b on this number 5? 2 pi over 1. What's that make the period? 2 pi. Halfway is pi. 1/2 of that and 1.5 pi. So what are your coordinates? Well, this minimum would be pi over 2, comma, -3. This would be 3 pi over 2, comma, +3. Number 7, we have the amplitude to be 1. We know that the period is 2 pi over b. 2 pi over b, which is 2, makes the period just pi. So halfway would be 1/2 pi. 1/2 of 1/2 is 1/4 pi. Be very careful here. 0/4 pi, 1/4 pi, 2/4 pi, which is 1/2 pi. What would go here now? 3/4 pi and 4/4 or 1 pi. So what are the coordinates of my maximums and minimums? This would be at pi over 4, comma, 1. And this would be at 3 pi over 4 comma negative 1. I will ask for the coordinates of the maximums and minimums. On from 7, let's look at 9. 9 is a sine graph, sine wave. It starts at the origin, it goes up, down, and up. The amplitude I'm hoping you're noticing should be 3. What is 2 pi over b? What is b? 2 pi divided by 1/2 means times 2, right? So that makes the period 4 pi. When you divide by 1/2, you're really multiplying by its reciprocal of 2. Half of 4 pi is 2 pi. Half of 2 pi is 1 pi. 0 pi, 1 pi, 2 pi, this would be 3 pi. So what are the coordinates of the maximum here? Pi 3 and 3 pi comma negative 3. The absolute value of A is the period. So I'm sorry, the amplitude. So the amplitude on this would be 4. So that means it goes up to 4 and down to negative 4. The period is 2 pi over b. 2 pi over what is b? Pi. So what does that make your period? 2. So this is 2. This would be 1. Half of that is 1/2. 0 halves, 1/2. 2 halves. What do you think would go here? 3 halves. And then finally 4 halves, which is 2. So that's how I'm counting by halves. Once we have that, we should be able to label our maximums and minimums. This maximum would be x 1/2 comma y is 4. This would be the x value of 3 halves, the y value of negative 4. Okay, 9, 11, I guess 15 we're going to look at. 15 is a sine wave. Sine waves normally go upward. This has a negative, which means it's going to start in a downward direction. Okay, again, instead of going upward, because of that negative, this is going to start downward and do something like this. What is the amplitude? It is the absolute value of A. What is A? Negative 1. So that makes the amplitude 1. The period is 2 pi over B. 2 pi over what is B? B is 2/3. So that means you have 2 pi divided by this fraction means times the reciprocal, doesn't it? So does that make this 3 pi? Because that could cancel with that, or you could call it 6 over 2 times pi. So the period, I believe, should be 3 pi. So if this is 3 pi, be very careful. What's halfway? You double the denominator, 3 pi over 2. If you want to take half of that, again, you double the denominator. So it would be 3 pi over 4. Now here's tricky. We're counting by 3/4. 0/4, 3/4. Add another 3/4 would be 6/4. 0/4 plus 3/4 is 3/4. Plus 3/4 is 6/4, which is 3 halves. Add another 3/4 and I think you'd have 9/4. Add another 3/4 and I think you'd have 12/4, which is 3, right? So what goes here is what I'm asking. 9/4 pi. So after we counted by 3/4, I'm going to make a little room and label my maximums and minimums. So what is the coordinate of these this maximum right here? 9 pi over 4 comma 1. This minimum would be 3 pi over 4 comma negative 1. Again, you can punch these in a graphing calculator to check me if you don't trust me, but I think if you're in radian mode and you punch them in, this should be pretty accurate. Again, I'm going to ask you to probably do these without a calculator. Okay, again, these aren't bad because they don't have a phase shift. When we get to the ones with phase shifts, they're a little trickier. Please try to watch. Here is the one with a phase shift. So I'm going to initially draw it. It's a sine wave. So I'm initially going to sketch a sine wave. Please note that I'm doing it dotted because this is not the graph. This is just helping me to get the graph. Do you agree the amplitude is 1? Do you agree the period is 2 pi over b, and b is 1, so the period would be 2 pi? Half of that, half of pi, 1.5 pi, and 0. Any questions on my general sine wave? Now here's the tricky part. You take what's inside the parentheses, make it equal 0. Solve for x. Because it's positive, it means it's moving to the right. Because it is moving to the right, I think I should extend my curve to the left. Because if I go to the left, I'll be able to move it to the right. So, let's find these coordinates. If that's pi over 2, would this be negative pi over 2? If that's pi, would this be negative pi? Now I'm going to graph this. Are you ready? The final graph. I'm going to take every point and move it pi to the right. Do you see this point right here? Yes, no? Yes. Move it pi to the right. Would it be here? Do you see this point at the bottom? Yes? Yes. Move that pi to the right. Where would it be? Here? Yes? Yeah. Do you see this point here? Move it pi to the right. Where would it be? Here. Take this point right here. Move it pi to the right. Would it be over here? You might get the feel for what this is going to look like. And if I move that one pi, if I take this and go pi to the right, where would it be? Here. From pi, we would move to 2 pi. So there's my graph. So this, in fact, looks like a negative sine wave, I believe. Now I'm going to label the maximums and minimums. Maximum 3 pi over 2, 1, and this minimum would be at pi over 2 comma negative 1, right? Okay, 19 again is a sine wave. Again, please skip 27. I believe 27 was written incorrectly in the textbook, so do not do number 27. Okay, we're going to go to 19. It's a sine wave. So I'll sketch a sine wave. What's the amplitude and what's the period? See if you can get them. Amplitude is 1. And what's the period? 2 pi over b. So it'd be 2 pi over what happens to be b. A is 1, so the amplitude is 1. And it's bx, so b is 2. So what does that make the period? Pi. So this is pi, half of pi, half of a half is a fourth. 0 fourths, 1 fourth, 2 fourths, this would be at 3 fourths pi. Now what value makes the part inside equal 0? 2x minus pi equals 0. Add the pi and divide by 2. Because it's positive, that means everything's moving pi over 2 to the right. Again, because I'm moving it to the right, I might extend my graph to the left. So if that's pi over 4, that would be negative pi over 4. If this is pi over 2, this would be negative pi over 2. Now, I need to move everything pi over 2 to the right. If this is at negative pi over 2 and goes downward, and I move it to the right, what's it going to be at? If I move that pi over 2 to the right, would it not be here? And because it went downward, this is going to go downward, right? What would you get if you move this one pi over 2 to the right? I'm sorry, that should be pi over 4, shouldn't it? I don't know why I wrote pi over 2 on that one. Shouldn't this be negative pi over 4? If you move that pi over 2 to the right, wouldn't it be here? Take this point, move it pi over 2 to the right. Where would that be? Here? And you can probably guess the rest. What are the coordinates of the minimums? Pi over 4 comma negative 1, I think. Pi over 4 comma negative 1 is the coordinates here. And this would be 3 pi over 4 comma positive 1. Okay, 23. 23 is a sine wave, so I graph a sine wave. The amplitude is 1/2, so I go 1/2, negative 1/2. The period is 2 pi over b, so that makes a period 2 pi over 1. Making this 1 pi, making this 1/2 pi, making this 3/2 pi. So you take what's inside, make it equal 0. So I take that, make it equal 0, and because it's negative, I move everything pi over 2 to the left. So I took this point here, moved it pi over 2 to the left, and I got this point. I took the 1 at pi, 0, moved it pi over 2 to the left, got this point. Move this to the left pi over 2, move this one to the left pi over 2, and move this one to the left pi over 2. Would be about where? It would be about here, wouldn't it? And again, it's not a straight line, it curves. So what is your maximums? 0, 1/2, 2 pi, 1/2. What is the minimum here? Pi, negative 1/2. And hopefully this is a graph for 23. Okay, from 23 we're going to look at 35 because we haven't done any cosines. Cosines do not start at the origin. Cosines start at the maximum. They go down and up. Can anybody tell me why I'm not doing this one dotted like the previous three? There's no phase shift. I mean, there might be parentheses, but there's no phase shift to move it. Now, what's the amplitude? 1. And the period is 2 pi over b. What's b? So what does that make the period? Pi. That would be 1/2 pi, 1/4, 2/4, 3/4. And so what are the coordinates of my maximums? 0, 1, and pi, comma 1. What's the coordinates of your minimum? Pi over 2, comma negative 1. 37 is another cosine. So again, the cosine starts at the maximum. It comes down and up. And it does continue. This time, what's the amplitude? 4? Negative 4. And what's the period? 2 pi over b. B is 2 pi, isn't it? So that makes the period 1. That would be 1/2. That would be 1/4, 2/4, and that would be 3/4. So where are my maximums and minimums? I would have it at 0, 4, and 1, 4. Where's the minimum? 1/2, -4. I hope these helped, and if you have to do a phase shift on a cosine, it's done in the same way.